Harlan, take the picture. You're better behind the camera anyway. Tonight is supposed to be fun. Don't make that face. My husband has always been good at fixing things that nobody notices. Tonight, he can fix our camera angle. The laughter came louder this time. When I handed the phone back, the brass token on my keyring caught the light. Clara Bellamy stared at it. "Where did you get that?" "My father." Preston stepped between us. "Old factory junk." He took the token from my hand and slipped it into his pocket. Then, Serena opened a pastel pink folder and signed the authorization that started the closing clock. "Tomorrow," she said, "I sell Ridgway Works." I looked at her. "Don't sign that deal." She smiled. "Why would I listen to you now?" "Because there's something inside it you were never meant to see." She had no idea. The company worth $20 billion was mine. But by the time of the closing the next day, owning it might not be enough to save it. She waited until the photographers drifted toward the dessert table, then took my arm and walked me into the service corridor behind the ballroom. A young man carrying empty glasses made a point of looking at the floor as he passed. "You embarrassed me," she said. "I asked you not to sign something in front of the board, in front of the investors, in front of my father." Her voice stayed low, and low was always worse with Serena. "You knew what tonight meant to me. I knew what it used to mean to you." She flinched. For a second, something moved behind her eyes that I recognized from years earlier when we ate cold takeout on the floor of an apartment with no furniture. Then the door opened, and the party came back in. Preston came through it, carrying 2 glasses he had no intention of drinking. Tall, late 60s, a man who learned decades ago how to quiet a room by lowering his voice. He handed one to Serena and looked at me with what a stranger would have called warmth. "Harlan, no hard feelings about the photograph. You still have my father's token. I'll have it sent to your desk." He said it the way you promise a child you'll look for a lost toy later. Then he shifted into business. "Serena signed an executive security order tonight. Transaction systems are restricted to signatories and counsel at the end of the night." I looked at Serena. "You wrote that," I said to Preston. "She signed it," he said. That was when I understood he had planned for someone inside the building to make trouble. He hadn't planned on me. He'd simply built a door and closed it before anyone thought to try the handle. You need to understand what the closing meant. Ridgway Works is our oldest division. Forge and heavy fabrication, 400 and some people. When escrow released, asset control and operating licenses transferred the same morning. After that, unwinding it isn't a phone call. It's litigation, financing reversal, customer contracts already assigned to somebody else, and years of it. Deals like that are one-way doors. So I had until the scheduled closing to prove something I couldn't even name yet. The guests were collecting their coats when Clara Bellamy found me. Late 60s, small, 22 years running a plant floor. Now chair of the Employee Stewardship Council. The committee most executives think sends flowers when somebody retires. "Was that really your father's token?" she asked. "Yes." "Then somebody in your family understood what Ridgway was built to protect." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not going to explain it standing next to a coat rack." She pulled on her gloves. "Come see me tomorrow, early." Out in the parking structure, my phone buzzed with the automated evening transaction summary. Routine distribution. My access didn't die until the restriction took effect, so the system still thought I belonged. I scrolled to the attachment list the way you check a receipt you're not really reading. Annex A, Annex B, Annex D. I sat in my car with the engine off and read it 4 times. There was no Annex C. I didn't drive home. I drove 40 minutes east to Ridgeway Works, because that is where I go when I need to think. Late at night, the lot smells like scale and cutting oil. My father worked that middle building for nearly 2 decades. He clocked in on Nightline A17 and came home smelling exactly like that lot smells. Here is the part Serena did not know. When my father died, he left me what he had: profit-sharing certificates from a time when the company still paid workers in paper. Over the decades, through 2 consolidations he never lived to see, that position became something else. By the time it was reorganized under my name, the Hale Stewardship Trust held 52% of the economic ownership of Crescent Forge Industries. $20 billion, more or less, depending on the week. I never lied about my job. I took the operational risk role on my own credentials and did the work. What I concealed was the size of what I owned. Serena believed my family held small legacy investments, and I let her keep that number. Years earlier, I used owner influence quietly, through a director who owed me nothing but courtesy, to push a plant expansion forward before operational testing was finished. I was 35 and absolutely sure. The line came within 1 failed hydraulic certification of putting people in the hospital. I never slept right again about it. So I did something most people would call insane. I transferred ordinary voting authority into an independent governance structure and had it written into the trust. Ownership stayed with me. Judgment went to people who could tell me no. My ownership cannot cancel a normal executive transaction, and if I use it as a weapon in a live deal, independent directors can freeze my voting rights on the spot. There is one exception. 1. If there is a documented undisclosed conflict, a benefit flowing to a director or officer that the board was never clearly shown. The governance process can suspend the transaction while it's reviewed, which meant my goal that night was not to reveal who I was. It was much smaller and much harder. Find out what is in Annex C before the closing. Theo Brennan met me at the east door with 2 coffees. Early 50s, reading glasses pushed up into gray hair. 19 years managing plant systems, and no longer surprised by anything except courtesy. I asked him a question I'd been turning over since the summary came through. Whether Ridgeway's numbers had moved in any way he couldn't explain. He pulled up months of order routing. Beginning the previous year, high-margin work, the runs that make Ridgeway look like a business instead of a museum, had been reassigned to 2 other plants. Never in one batch. 4 or 5 contracts at a time, each with a defensible reason. I thought it was restructuring, Theo said. They told us it was restructuring. On paper, Ridgeway had lost about 19% of its contribution margin in under a year. On the floor, nothing had changed. Same crews, same lines, same skill. Somebody had simply moved the good work out of the building. That is exactly what you would build if you wanted to sell a division cheaply, and have the board feel relieved when you did. I asked Theo to open the transaction archive so I could compare the reassignments against the sale valuation model. He typed. The terminal thought about it. Access restricted. Transaction materials. The restriction had come early, or someone had pushed it. Either way, the door I'd been told about earlier was already shut and I was outside it. Theo, who approved the order transfers, I went into the plant's own scheduling records, not deal materials. and nobody had thought to lock them. The reassignments had gone through a capacity allocation committee. Serena's name wasn't on any of it. She'd been running industrial services then, 2 floors and 1 world away. The committee chair on all those months of records was Preston Mercer. Theo and I spent the next hours doing something painfully ordinary. We rebuilt the order movements from systems we were still perfectly authorized to touch. Plant scheduling, shipping manifests, maintenance logs, labor hours. Nothing sealed, nothing borrowed. Every reassigned contract had moved to a plant with higher unit cost. 2 had been quietly subcontracted back to Ridgway at a lower internal rate, and the valuation model in the sale deck ran on trailing 12-month margin. The exact window that had been hollowed out. It proved the sale case had been shaped. It did not prove a crime. Any board member could say reallocating work between plants is a documented strategic decision within authority. I had a strong argument about judgment, and none at all about integrity. Then, early the next morning, looking for something else entirely, I found the thing that changed the question. It was in a finance department index, not the deal room, an internal register of the kind that tracks what exists so auditors can find it later. 1-line item referencing a closing package attachment. Executive Beneficiary Schedule, Annex C. An operational annex would be equipment schedules, permits, employee transfer terms. A beneficiary schedule is not that. A beneficiary schedule is a list of who receives special payments when the deal closes. Not why is Ridgway being sold. Who gets paid if Ridgway is sold? Early that morning, I was standing in the executive corridor on the 22nd floor, still in last night's shirt, when Serena came out of her new office holding a coffee and a binder in pastel pink covers. "Did your father show you Annex C?" I asked. She frowned. Not the frown of a woman caught, the frown of a woman doing arithmetic. "There is no Annex C," she said. "I've known Serena Hale since she was 29. I know the specific way her chin lifts when she has decided a falsehood is worth the cost. Her chin did not lift, but she also didn't ask why I was asking, which is what an innocent CEO does at that hour. So I stood in the hallway, unable to tell whether my wife was being deceived or was already inside the deception. That question sat in my chest for the next several hours. "Harlan," she said, "go home, change your shirt." Preston's counterattack arrived not long after, and it was better than anything I would have written for him. He did not insult me. He didn't mention the token or the photograph. What he did was walk into Serena's office in front of 2 senior executives and a transaction lawyer and express concern. I know what he said because Serena repeated it to me an hour later, word for word, in the tone of a woman testing whether it was true. He said that when one spouse is promoted past the other, the marriage produces a predictable kind of interference. He said he had seen good men do strange things out of a pride they couldn't name. He said he was worried about me. Soon after, a memo went out over Serena's authority, extending the restriction to all deal-related materials and correspondence, and naming me specifically as a party excluded pending review of an internal complaint. There was no internal complaint. There was a sentence about one. Serena found me by the elevators. She had the memo on her phone. She didn't apologize for it. "Stay away from this transaction," she said. "As my CEO or as my wife?" She looked at me for a long moment, and the elevator doors opened and closed twice behind her. "Right now," she said, "I'm not sure there's a difference." I drove east again with the sun coming up behind me, and my access to my own company shrinking by the hour. Clara's office at Ridgeway is a converted supervisor's booth above the floor, with a window over the forge line. She had a folding chair waiting, which told me she'd expected me early. I put my keyring on her desk and turned the brass token face up. It's about the size of a quarter, worn smooth on one side, stamped on the other. Night Line A Scene. A-17 was the second shift forge crew for many years, she said. My first supervisor came off that crew. She looked up. Your father was on it. Nearly 2 decades. Years earlier, the company that became Crescent Forge was nearly sold in pieces by a management group that had quietly arranged consulting contracts with the buyer. The night crews found out because night crews always do. A-17 refused to run a shift. They clocked in, stood at their stations, and would not start the line until somebody put the terms in front of them. What they got, eventually, was a promise written into the company's operating charter. Clara quoted it to me from memory, and the wording has barely changed over the decades. A core operating division shall not be transferred through a transaction involving an undisclosed personal benefit to any officer or director of the company. The lawyers moved it into the governance policy, Clara said. Section 11. Nobody reads Section 11. She sat back. But if the council receives a credible indication of an undisclosed conflict in a divisional transfer, I can demand an integrity review. That freezes nothing by itself. It requires disclosure and delays certification. How credible is credible? Not a feeling, not a grudge from a husband whose wife made a joke about him at a party. She said it kindly, which made it land harder. I need a record. Something a person who dislikes you would still have to admit exists. Then I told her what my father said when he put the token in my hand, shortly before he died. Never own a place you would be ashamed to clock into. Standing in Clara's booth, I heard it the other way for the first time in 20 years. And I did not like what it said about me. Serena had been busy that morning, too, though I didn't learn most of it until later. Around the same time, she had gone through her closing binder page by page, because that is who she is. She reads the appendices, and she found the same jump I had found. Annex B, then Annex D. She called her father. She did not call me. What she told me, he said, was this. Annex C was an administrative schedule handled by Banking Council, not part of the executive package, nothing that required her signature or her attention. She told me she accepted that. I don't think she did. I think she accepted the sentence and kept the question. But she did not tell me she had looked. Theo was waiting for me downstairs. He'd gone into the document management history, not the deal room, the housekeeping layer that logs what got uploaded and when and by whom, the same way a plant logs a maintenance ticket. Not secret, just tedious. The record showed a file titled Executive Beneficiary Schedule uploaded to the closing package on one day and removed from the CEO's distribution copy days later. Removed from her copy, still in the master. We could not see one word of what was inside it. We could prove with a timestamp and a system hash that it existed, that it had been placed where the incoming CEO would see it, and that somebody had taken it out. He printed 2 copies and signed the system attestation as responsible systems manager, which put his name on it. 53 years old, a daughter in her 2nd year of college. He signed it anyway. Later that morning, I stopped at our apartment for a clean shirt, because a man who walks into a governance session looking like he slept in a parking lot has already lost half the argument. Serena was there taking her binder off the counter. "Why are you doing this today?" she said. "Of all days." "Because tomorrow is too late." "That's not an answer. That's a slogan." She set the binder down. 12 years, Harlan, and there is always another layer with you. You knew about the order transfers before you asked me. You knew about the annex before you asked me. You call that being careful? I stood in my own kitchen with my hand on the counter, and I almost told her the trust, the 52%, the firewall, the whole architecture of the life I had been living next to her. I have told myself since that it was governance, that revealing ownership in a live transaction would compromise the review before Clara convened it. That was true. It was also not why I stopped. I stopped because if I told her that morning, I would never again know whether the woman looking back at me was choosing me or the number. So I said nothing, and she picked up her binder, and the door closed, and I lost the last hour in which telling her would have mattered. I called Clara from the car and read her the attestation. "A file placed for the CEO and removed before she saw it," she said. "That's not a feeling, that's a record." She convened a limited emergency integrity session for shortly before the original closing, herself, 2 independent directors, and transaction counsel with authority to require production of the withheld annex before certification. For the first time since Serena had handed me her phone in a ballroom, I believed I could stop this without ever saying who I was. Then, she told me something that made my hands go cold in a good way for a while. Transaction counsel had logged a request that morning from the CEO's office, asking whether the closing could be held until an outstanding annex was reviewed. Serena had asked for a delay on her first morning. Before I said a word to her about the record, the request had been denied at the vice chairman's direction. I learned later how he did it, because Serena repeated it to me, the way you repeat something lodged sideways in you. He said, "A CEO who flinches on her first morning is a CEO nobody follows." I called Theo and told him. "So we win?" he said. "We don't need to prove what's inside it," I said. "We only need to prove they hid it." I turned into the headquarters garage. My badge still opened the gate. 2 building security officers were standing at the elevator lobby, and Preston Mercer was standing between them in no particular hurry with his hands in his pockets. The session did convene. That's what makes it worse. A conference room on the 21st floor, 2 independent directors, Clara at the head of the table, the attestation printed at every seat. Then Preston asked to be recognized and set a bound folder on the table and said, "Before the council acts on that document, the directors should see how it was obtained." It was an internal security finding dated that morning, 6 pages. The document, Management History, Theo had certified, had been retrieved after the extended access restriction naming me had taken effect. That was the whole finding, and everything after it was decoration. To pull the upload history, Theo had used a systems maintenance path, a legitimate route he uses many times a week to fix things, and which under a memo only 90 minutes old now touched deal materials. The data was accurate. Nobody in the room argued it wasn't. The retrieval violated a policy that was only 90 minutes old. The council cannot receive material obtained in breach of an access control, one of the directors said, regardless of what it says. If we do, every finding we make today is challengeable. Clara fought it. She argued that a policy issued after the underlying facts existed could not retroactively sanitize the removal of a document from the CEO's package. She was right. She was also outvoted 2-1 in about 6 minutes. Then it got worse, in 3 directions at once. Theo was suspended before the session ended, not fired, suspended with pay pending review, which sounds gentle and is not. His badge stopped working while he was still standing on the floor at Ridgeway. My credibility went next. Preston read into the record the memo about an internal complaint, the timeline of my access restriction, and the fact that I had entered the executive corridor early on the morning of my wife's first closing. He never once said the word jealous. He had installed that word the night before and left it running. Then, transaction counsel turned to Serena and asked whether I had, before the access restriction, asked her about the transaction in a personal setting. She looked at me. I want to be fair, and being fair costs me something. She did not lie, and she did not embellish. She said I had raised the deal with her at home more than once, including that morning. Then she signed a 2-paragraph statement saying so. Every word of it was true. Assembled the way Preston assembled it, it meant I had used my marriage as an intelligence channel. The session was closed without action. Minutes later, building security escorted me down 21 floors and out through the loading side of the lobby, which is where they take you when they don't want the main doors to see it. Serena caught up with me at the glass. "You think I used you?" I said. "That's what you signed." "I signed what happened." "I don't know what to think anymore," she said. "You've been 3 steps ahead of me for 2 days, and every time I ask what you know, you ask me another question." Soon after, a notice went out to the distribution list I was no longer on. Theo forwarded it to my personal phone from his own. The closing ceremony had been moved forward. 45 minutes earlier than planned. Executive floor, investors, and internal feed. Preston hadn't just beaten me. He'd cut 15 minutes off the clock because he could. I sat on a concrete planter outside my own company's headquarters, in a suit with no badge, no ally, no admissible record, no wife, and 34 minutes. I had built my entire strategy around knowing something before anyone else did. Find the hidden thing, hold it, produce it at the right moment. Quiet, careful, clean hands. Preston had taken the shape of my own secrecy and handed it to a room as evidence of manipulation. He didn't have to prove I was dishonest. He only had to point at how much I was holding. I had spent years telling myself secrecy kept power honest. That morning, I finally admitted it had also kept me safe. That was the end of my method. Not damaged, finished. Every road that ran through a private document or a quiet ally was closed, and pushing on any of them only made me look like what he'd said I was, so I stopped trying to get into the file. So I thought about the closing procedure itself, which is not secret. It's boilerplate, printed in the front of every divisional transfer this company has executed. Before an executive signs a divisional closing, she certifies one thing: that, to her knowledge, no director, officer, or immediate family member receives an undisclosed benefit from the transaction. I did not need to know what Annex C said. I needed Serena to ask for it before she signed that certification, because the moment a sitting CEO makes that request on the record, counsel is required to produce it. Not because I proved anything, because she asked. New objective. Stop trying to prove the hidden thing privately. Force it into the open publicly, in front of investors, an employee feed, and a board where nobody could restrict it or call it improperly obtained, which meant I had to do the one thing I had spent years arranging never to do. I called Clara from the planter and told her who I was. I gave her the trust's registered name, the independent transfer agent, and the counsel who maintains the ownership records, and told her not to take my word for any of it. "You've been in operational risk for 6 years," she said. "Yes." "Harlan?" A pause. "Why?" "Because my father spent nearly 2 decades on a night shift for a company whose owners never walked the floor, and I decided not to be that. And because years earlier, I used ownership to override an engineering decision and nearly hurt people." She verified it in 4 minutes with the transfer agent. Then she told me the thing I needed to hear, and she did not soften it. "Ownership gets you into the room," she said. "It does not give you the right to stop the signature." "I know." "Then say the rest out loud, because I won't be the one breaking it to a room of investors. If you identify yourself as controlling owner during an active transaction and interfere in it, your own firewall puts your voting authority into recusal immediately. Yes, you'd be spending the only real weapon you have in the act of picking it up." That's right. That was the price. I would lose my anonymity permanently in front of every person I worked with and lose my vote for a recusal period I had written myself. In exchange, I got standing to be in the room and speak. Under Section 11, Clara could grant a beneficial owner one recognized speaking opportunity at a divisional closing. One, not a motion, not a vote. A chance to say something out loud in front of witnesses. I filed the notice of beneficial ownership with the corporate secretary's office. Then I sent Serena a message. 9 words. "Before you sign, ask who Annex C pays." She didn't answer me. What she did, I only learned this afterward, was request the complete, unredacted closing package from Transaction Counsel in writing under her own authority as chief executive. The package came back in 11 minutes. Annex A, Annex B, Annex D. She had now asked for everything on the record and been handed a set with a hole in it. I went home for a few minutes and put on the navy suit, the one I'd worn to my father's service. I took my employee badge off the lanyard and left it on the kitchen counter next to my wife's coffee cup, and walked out without it for the first time in 6 years. They held the closing on the executive floor in the long room with the glass wall that looks north over the river. 40-some people, board members, the acquiring consortium and their counsel, our largest investors, senior staff along the back wall, and a camera feeding the internal employee channel to every plant in the company. Ridgway's break room included. 2 days earlier, my humiliation had cost me a ballroom. Whatever happened here would happen in front of 400 people watching on a screen bolted above a coffee machine. A memo had gone to senior staff shortly before. 3 sentences. The chief executive's spouse had been suspended from transaction systems after an attempt at unauthorized interference. The matter was under review, and the closing would proceed. Serena was at the head of the table, with the closing binder and a pen and a face I could not read from the door. I learned afterward what Preston told her in the minutes before I arrived, that the financing expired that day, that the consortium would read delay as instability and reprice, that the market forgives a hard decision and never forgives hesitation. He framed obedience as courage, and he had used that on her since she was 19. And I learned something else afterward, which mattered more. Shortly before, Serena had asked transaction counsel one question in a hallway, with nobody else present. If I request the beneficiary schedule during closing, does it have to be produced? Counsel told her yes. Materially relevant closing attachments must be produced on the executive's request before certification, but only if she asked. She thanked him and told no one. Not her father, not me. I entered under a beneficial owner credential. About a third of the room knew me only as the husband from the celebration, the one who took the photograph. Another third knew me as the operational risk specialist who sent them uncomfortable memos. Nobody there had ever heard the words printed on the credential I was handed at the door. Preston did not react at all. That was the part that frightened me. He watched me take a seat along the wall and did not change expression. He had already worked out what I was and decided it was survivable. He knew an owner who stands up in a live transaction, hands over his own vote the moment he opens his mouth. And while he waited, he took my father's brass token out of his jacket pocket and turned it over between his thumb and forefinger, slowly. The way a man handles a coin he intends to keep. At the new closing time, Preston stood and introduced the transaction. He was good. I have never once thought he wasn't. He talked about a company built on iron in a century that runs on data. About the discipline of letting go of a building your grandfather loved. About protecting 400 jobs by handing them to a buyer who could invest in them. Then he turned to Serena and said the company had chosen a chief executive with the courage to sign it. Serena moved to the signing table. The papers were laid out with the certification page on top. Clara Bellamy stood up. Under Section 11 of the governance policy, she said, the Stewardship Council recognizes a beneficial owner of record for one statement prior to certification. Then she sat down. That is all she did. That is all she was ever able to do. 40 people turned around and looked at me. I stood up in my Navy suit with no badge on it, and I did not accuse anyone of anything. Serena, I said, before you certify this closing, will you confirm that no director, officer, or immediate family member receives an undisclosed benefit from this transaction? Preston was on his feet before I finished. He told the room I was a disgruntled employee, suspended from deal systems that morning, and the husband from the celebration, and let them remember the photograph. He said a marriage in difficulty did not belong in a closing. He said it without heat, with genuine regret in his voice, and for about 15 seconds it worked completely. You have no standing here, Preston said. Actually, I said, I do. I said that the Hale Stewardship Trust holds 52% of the economic ownership of Crescent Forge Industries, that it was built out of profit-sharing certificates earned on a night shift at Ridgeway Works, and that I am its sole beneficial owner. Nobody gasped. That isn't what happens. The room goes strange and quiet, while everyone rearranges 2 years of small interactions with you in about 4 seconds. Serena's hand came off the closing papers. She looked at me the way you look at a person you thought you had finished learning. Clara confirmed it in one sentence, that the independent transfer agent had verified the ownership records that morning. And then she stopped, because verification was the whole of what she was permitted to do. And Preston smiled, because I had just done what he'd been waiting for. Then you also know, he said, that you cannot vote on this transaction. That's right. I said it into a silent room, and it was the most important sentence I said all day. I told them why. Years earlier, I used owner influence to push a plant expansion past an incomplete certification. Nobody was hurt. It was close. Afterward, I put my own voting authority behind an independent firewall, because a company this size should not depend on one man being sure he is right. So no, I said, I can't stop this. By standing here, I've suspended my own vote. That's not a technicality. That's the design. And I'm the one who designed it. Then I looked at my wife. And I hid too much from my wife, because I was afraid of finding out whether she loved me or what I owned. That wasn't honesty. It was another kind of control. I'm not asking you to listen to your husband, and I'm not asking you to obey the owner. I pointed at the certification page in front of her. I'm asking the CEO to ask one question before she puts her name on it. Serena looked at the papers for a long moment. Then she turned to Transaction Counsel. Produce Annex C. Serena, Preston said, you don't need it. Produce Annex Counsel opened a laptop. Nobody spoke. Somewhere behind me, a phone buzzed twice and was silenced. The executive beneficiary schedule went up on the screen where the buyer's logo had been 30 seconds earlier. It was not complicated. That's what I remember. 9 line items, advisory fees, a retention pool, 2 escrow reserves, and 1 endowment commitment of $200 million payable on closing to the Mercer Civic Foundation. Serena read it twice. Who controls Mercer Civic Foundation? Nobody had to answer. Counsel pulled the public corporate record in under a minute, and it listed Preston Mercer as controlling chair. That was the whole case, not theft necessarily. Something simpler, and, in a company like ours, worse. The board had approved the sale of its oldest division without being told that the vice chairman recommending it controlled a $200 million beneficiary. Preston did not fold. I had expected him to. Men like Preston almost never do. He turned to them and argued that the foundation funds apprenticeships and community colleges in 3 states, and every dollar of it is charitable. The schedule had been reviewed by banking counsel. The delay was the real damage. Financing would lapse. The consortium would walk. The market would punish a company that couldn't close its own deal. Half of that was true. That's what made it dangerous. Then he turned to Serena and stopped being a statesman. Sign it now, he said, or your first act as chief executive will be destroying the deal you were hired to finish. That was his real weapon. Not the money, not the lawyers. 11 years of telling his daughter that people would always credit somebody else for her success, and then standing in front of 40 of those people and offering to prove himself right. Serena looked at him. Then she looked down at the certification page with her name printed under the signature line. I won't certify something I wasn't allowed to see, she said. She set the pen down on the table and did not sign. I'd like to tell you that fixed something between us. It didn't. It proved one thing, that when she was forced to choose in public with everything she had wanted on the table, she did not complete the lie. Preston destroyed himself in the next 90 seconds, and he did it the way I should have predicted. He could not let go of control. He called for immediate board action to remove Serena from the signing role for cause and to authorize himself as vice chairman to execute the closing on the company's behalf. He was still speaking when Clara stood up. Section 11, she said. A person named on a disclosed beneficiary schedule cannot assume the executing role in the same transaction while the disclosure is under review. That isn't the council's opinion. That's the governance policy, and it's been in the charter for decades. She was quoting the promise the night crews had extracted decades earlier. in a building 40 minutes east of that room. 2 independent directors moved for the conflict freeze. It carried without discussion. The closing stopped, not because I owned the company, because Preston reached for the pen himself. He stood a moment with his hand still half raised. Then he took my father's brass token out of his jacket pocket and dropped it onto the signing table beside the unsigned papers. "Take your factory souvenir." I walked up and picked it up. The little chain link that held it to my key ring had been bent open sometime in the last day and a half in a pocket. I set it down again deliberately, beside the certification page nobody had signed. My father never thought it was a souvenir. That's all I said. There was no applause. A room of investors sat very still while a consortium's lawyers packed their bags, and the camera kept feeding it to a break room I could have found in the dark. By the end of that week, the shape of it was clear, and none of it looked like winning. The sale of Ridgeway Works was suspended, pending an independent conflict investigation. Preston Mercer was removed from the transaction committee and resigned his vice chairmanship not long after in a letter about family priorities that fooled nobody. Serena was placed under an executive ethics review because she had signed a statement against me and had known about a missing annex before she raised it. She remained chief executive provisionally, which means being handed the job and the doubt together. Theo's suspension was lifted with a written finding that his retrieval was made in good faith under an ambiguous policy. He is still at Ridgeway. He still won't let me buy the coffee, and my voting authority went into recusal for more than a year, exactly as the firewall required, because I had stood up in a live transaction and interfered. I owned 52% of a $20 billion company and cannot cast a vote in it until the recusal ends. I did not become chief executive. I did not take Preston's chair. My name was in 3 tree trade publications within a day, and my anonymity was gone. I met Serena at Ridgeway Works weeks later. She was in a plain gray coat, no pastel pink anywhere. Her black hair still in the neat bun she has worn since she was 30. She had driven 40 minutes east on an ordinary day to stand in a lot that smells like cutting oil. She held out the brass token. She had taken it to a jeweler and had the bent chain link replaced. "You already had it back," she said. "I know. I wanted to fix the part he broke. I made you a joke in front of 200 people because I was ashamed of a man who deserved better, and I signed a statement knowing how they'd read it. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I needed to say it where you could hear it. You chose the truth when it finally cost you something," I told her. "I respect that." She nodded, but respect is not the same thing as trust. "I know," she said. We stood there a while longer. She drove back to the city, and I stayed. We are still separated, and I have stopped pretending I can arrange how that ends. Serena confused status with proof. She spent 11 years believing that if the title were big enough, nobody could take her worth away from her. I did the same thing with silence. I told myself that hiding what I owned kept power honest, that it let me see who people really were. It did. It also meant nobody ever saw who I was. And when I finally needed my wife to trust my judgment, I had spent 12 years teaching her not to. When the recusal ends, I am not going to hide from what my name is attached to. Not for recognition, because a man who owns a place and refuses to be seen in it has found a sophisticated way of never being responsible for it. Before I left the plant that afternoon, I clipped the repaired token back onto the key ring in my navy jacket pocket. Somewhere inside the building, the shift bell sounded. Through the wired glass, I could see people moving toward the floor for an ordinary day in a building that still belongs to the company my father clocked into for nearly 2 decades. The token clicked against my keys. My father was right. Owning a place was never the hard part. The hard part was becoming someone worthy of clocking into it. So, tell me in the comments, if someone finally chose the truth after betraying your trust, would you forgive them, or would you simply respect the choice and walk away?